Hello everybody out there, and a very warm welcome to the National Gallery of Canada, virtually speaking. We're very happy to welcome you into the gallery spaces, and boy oh boy are we ever happy to be back in the gallery spaces surrounded by some of the beautiful works in our collection here. We're so happy to be able to share them with you. Frankly, I'm a little bit just happy to get out of my house. And we're here particularly today to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the first official exhibition of the Group of Seven, which happened on May 7th, 1920, in Toronto at the institution at that time known as the Art Gallery of Toronto and now known as the Art Gallery of Ontario. It was a group that had been working in a similar vein, a group of artists that had been working in a similar vein for several years by the time the exhibition opened. And Mylan, my friend behind the camera, is reminding me to tell you that who I am, what am I doing here, how did I get in to this closed building? My name is Morel, and I'm an interpreter, animator here at the gallery. So we give the programming in the National Gallery, including many tours of different art installations. Today we're in the Canadian and Indigenous galleries, and we're right at the kind of crux, the turning point of the physical galleries between more historical work from time immemorial up until say the 19th century. We're turning now from the 19th century into the 20th century, and if we were to continue down the other side of the galleries, we'd move right into the heart of modernism and all the way up to 1967. So these men, they were all men at the beginning, wanted to bring landscape painting into a new direction, to bring it in a new direction. At the time in Canada, there were dominant styles in landscape painting as well as in art in general. And they were very much wanting to move art in a modern direction, and very importantly, to depict, to show the specifically Canadian landscape where they lived. And I'm standing beside a very important, it's seen as a seminal work in influencing and inspiring and creating a new direction for these men to work in. It's a piece by A.Y. Jackson called Terre Sauvage. So even in the title, you have an indication of what their interest was. It was in a wild, untamed nature, rather than the types of environments that some of which were common in landscape painting at the time. When this piece was exhibited, it was not universally praised. This is a piece from a little bit earlier than the actual opening of the beginning of the Group of Seven. So it's from 1913. And although it was not appreciated by all of the critics, there were a few outliers, and certainly the artist colleagues of A.Y. Jackson very much, some of them saw this as a movement in the right direction. You'll notice there, already you can kind of notice some of the features of the Group of Seven: simplified forms, dynamic colors. It's a move towards modernism in a few respects, and definitely a depiction of a very Canadian shield, conifer-filled landscape. We should mention who the Group of Seven are. Let's go through it all together. I'm sure many of you know. So let's try alphabetically. We've got Franklin Carmichael. We've got A.Y. Jackson. Oh, I've already messed up the alphabet, I think. Lauren Harris. We've got Arthur Lismer, J.H. MacDonald, back to France or Frank Johnston, and F.H. Farley. Those are the original members. And as the group continues to work, some members will leave, some will join. And the very central Canadian focus, the Ontario focus, Ontario-Quebec focus of the group of 7 will expand a little bit to include members from outside of that really Toronto-centric scene. Let's move next to a central piece in this room, which is not by the group of 7, but it helps to give a little bit of context to the time period and the place that we're in when the group of 7 emerges. So we're going to do a little dance here, and Mylan's going to try to follow me.
Well, first I'm going to actually show the label here. So after every work, if you might have missed the introduction to the work or the title, I will get close to the label so you can see the title, the date, as well as the artist name here. A bit more information.
And I'll mention one other fun fact about this piece, which is if you're familiar with what's called the Taiga Garden out front of the National Gallery with the conifer trees and the kind of rocky outcroppings, that landscape piece designed by Cornelia Hahn Oberlander was inspired specifically by Terre Sauvage. All right, let's do our dance.
So we're looking at the centerpiece here, which Morale will give us more information about.
So if you're familiar with the Canadian and Indigenous galleries here at the National Gallery, you'll know that when you first enter this room, a central piece is this wonderful canoe made by an anonymous Algonquin artist from around 1920. And it's here for a few different reasons. But one of the reasons is to remind us of the presence of Indigenous people in the land that became called Canada, the long presence, and also the connection between the canoe technology, which is an Indigenous design in this case, and members of the group of 7 who went out into the bush, out into nature, out into areas that to city dwellers of the time would have been seen as very remote and hard to access by way of this technology. So Tom Thompson is probably the most famous for taking his canoe out into the waters of Algonquin Park, for example. It's sometimes too easy to forget these invisible connections, so it has pride of place in this room as a reminder, in part. The other thing to be reminded of is that the group of 7 are heralded for forging in some way our identity as Canadians as being tied to nature, very much connected to the land and to nature. But that's not a concept that was invented by the group of 7. It's obviously a part of Indigenous culture, history, and also art making that predates the formation of the group of 7 by thousands of years. So a strong connection with the land has been a part of the identity of the people living in this land for a very long time, much longer than 100 years at this point. Let's turn now to what was going on in the European-influenced art world of this time. So we're going to do another little spin here. And then I will give you the details on the Algonquin-made canoe.
Okay. So we're going to look at the salon.
So on this wall you'll find a salon hanging of a diversity of styles and genres of painting that were dominant around the turn of the century, end of the 19th century, early 20th century. And you can see, just in terms of subject matter, we can find portraits, still life. There are scenes of everyday life depicted as well, interiors. And landscapes, but there are landscapes, or there are works by members that would later become members of the group of seven, artists that would become the group of seven. Marlene's going to show us an example. This one is by Lauren Harris. But what you'll notice as a difference between his focus here and the focus he adopts later on is when the group of seven forms, they do decide, although they've worked in many other genres of painting, they decide to focus their attention on landscape, and specifically on wild Canadian landscape. Whereas here we have more of a town, a scene in town or in the city. The other landscapes we can find on this wall tend to be gentle, welcoming, peaceful, tranquil landscapes, transmitted either by way of the palette or the scene, the composition that's chosen. Sometimes they're working in a slightly modern vein, like the Impressionist styles that Marlene is showing you. Even so, these are landscapes that are non-threatening, and they're often pastoral, such as this one, which is in farmland. So we'll see that one of the big breaks that the group of seven make is that they move their lens, they move their focus deep into the bush of Northern Ontario. Sure, so we're going to take a look at the other wall, which shows us an example of most of the initial members of the group of seven. And what I love is hearing the comments, what you might be noticing immediately in terms of a difference between the paintings we just saw and the ones we're looking at now. So feel free to write those in the comments and Marlene will share them.
Yeah, so just have a look here at these works on the white wall, and just thinking about the works that we saw on the red wall, if you notice any differences between these works of art, or in the style, or maybe in the way it's painted, feel free to leave a comment below. We haven't received any comments, but I'm sure Morel will talk about it. I have a question though.
Sure.
The style of hanging is different. I noticed on the red wall, a lot of the paintings were very clustered together, and here, if I just do a quick pan of the room, they seem to be more isolated.
So that's a reminder in part that at the turn of the century, the artists working in Canada were very much importing, bringing with them the traditions of Europe. When we're talking about non-Indigenous artists, they were bringing the schooling, the academic conventions, and the traditions of Europe. And one of those traditions, in terms of exhibition style, comes from the salon originally of the Louvre, where the Academy would exhibit many works close together, floor to ceiling, exactly as we see here. And so it's used as a design moment in our galleries to enforce that idea that the artists of the time were generally still so heavily influenced by European thought in terms of the art world. As we move into the modern era and the contemporary era, there starts to be a sense that works need a little bit more room around them to breathe. But maybe, Marlene, you have more to add to that.
Well, I think it's the same. They're more isolated. I feel when I look at a work like this, I'm less distracted by the other works. Not to say that they aren't striking, but these ones really allow for an experience between myself and the work of art.
Sure, yeah, which may be a particularly modern concept. So these, which is a lovely segue into the fact that these artists, as I mentioned earlier, they really considered themselves modern, bringing the art world into the modern era. And that is both in the sense that they felt free to express their own interpretation of the subject, to work in a style that was fast, not always according to academic conventions of beauty or a composition, and that they chose a subject that had heretofore been considered fairly lowly, landscape, right? In the ladder of hierarchy that there was as to the importance of a painting or an artwork, landscape was certainly below other forms, and in particular they chose landscapes that were, rough and wild, and perhaps didn't fit with the established conventions of a beautiful, even a romantic landscape. So that's part of the difference, right, that we see between the two walls. Another big difference is, as I mentioned earlier, the specifically Canadian nature of these landscapes. There are no farms here in these works at least. We're out in the wild. We're in a very kind of tumultuous weather moment here. So we have a storm. This work is called Stormy Weather, Georgian Bay. It's by Varley. And on top of that, the way that the work is created really echoes the environment. So there's these very strong movements that are evident on the canvas. If you come closer, Mylan, we can see the texture and the actual gestures of the artist on the canvas. Very evident, not polished, not cleaned up.
Especially, I see some spots here. It seems like I'm seeing the background.
Yeah, sure. You can see the support through the paint. So there's an unfinished, kind of spontaneous and alive quality to these landscapes, as opposed to a perfectly rendered, finished, or academic style of painting.
Can I just add, isn't it amazing that we're still seeing the shine of the paint come through?
Yes. So that's that beautiful oil paint, and it looks like it's still fresh.
Don't touch it.
Over 100 years later, I think we're a little under 1921, this work. So there's that way of working, that stylistic change. You'll notice also there are no people in these paintings. Right. Even though there were landscapes on the other wall, they often had a figure, people in them, or buildings. These don't have people, they don't even have animals in them. So there's a real sense of isolation and loneliness, sometimes melancholy, that's added to, in particularly the works on this wall, by the palette of colors used, which are sort of on the darker, more somber side. Interestingly, the group of seven was also criticized for its garish use of color, and we'll see a nice example of what that might have been with the next work.
Are we going to the next work?
I think that's a good cue to go to the next work.
Okay, just zoom in on the information here. So this is F.H. Farley, Stormy Weather, Georgian Bay, 1921.
I'm getting my directions from the director here.
Wow, this one's a little bit different from, if we just quickly compare it to one in the corner here. Large landscape. Still a large painting, but it looks different.
So, not only is the color palette quite different and striking in this work, but we have a totally different point of view from which the scene is painted. In all of the landscapes we've looked at so far, we have a somewhat traditional point of view in that we're pulled back somewhat from the subject. There's a very visible, very clear background, middle ground, foreground. There's a lot of space represented.
Yes.
This is a really up close and personal, sort of ant's eye view of a garden. We're right there in among this tangled garden, which is what this piece is called. And that's not the only difference. So far, we've seen pictures of pure wildness, let's say. I should note, I meant to say earlier with those other works that are, out in the middle of nature, because there are no people, because there are not even any animals, there is a sense that these are empty landscapes, that nobody lives in these places. There's kind of an implication there. It's important to remember that these were environments, places, territories where indigenous people in the land had lived, and for whom these were landscapes that were familiar to indigenous people that had lived in those lands for thousands of years. So from the perspective of a somewhat newly arrived European population, city dwelling, they might have seemed like an exotic sort of branching out into untouched nature. But that wasn't the same from every perspective. For many people, that was a familiar environment. So now we're sort of out of pure nature, we're into a garden, but it's still a very wild environment. And so nature seems to still be king in this image. And it's very wild, so wild that when it was exhibited, it was much criticized for being sort of a messy jumble. It was even compared to a big tomato salad.
Those are not tomatoes. Just to specify, those are not tomatoes.
So that might be a first impression, but if you spend a little more time with the painting, you can see that there are rhythms and harmonies in the work. So just to point a couple of those out, this is, by the way, by J.E.H. MacDonald. You see this curve of the sunflower, this very dominant yellow curve that jumps out. But if you look a little longer, you can see that that curve is repeated, or a similar curve, over and over again, whether in other sunflowers, leaves, the trees up above that are forming, these arcs.
Everything seems to kind of go inwards in a way.
That's right. There is a certain, like circularity to the composition. Even these flowers, you can find a lot of curves implied in the way that they're arranged. And in terms of the colors, which were deemed to be a little bit too excessive, a little bit too bright, there is nonetheless a harmony and a balance with the mauve in the background and in some of these flowers with the yellow, the bright yellow, and other complementary relationships, dynamics between the colors.
Wow.
J.H. MacDonald was one of the sort of, one of the foremost promoters, let's say, of the Group of Seven. Let's move next to a famous guy that you all know. I'm going to show you this label, and then we'll move on.
Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Mylan. I'm the camera woman. So just want to let you know, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below down here. We'll also be posting this video on our Instagram page, so you can comment or ask questions if you miss this live video.
So many of you will recognize this image. It's a quite well-known painting called the Jackpine by Tom Thomson. It's iconic now. It's a classic, even we could say it's a Canadian classic, which is an interesting thought when we reflect on the fact that when the Group of Seven first emerged, they were not universally praised by critics. They were not necessarily appreciated by everyone in the art world. And it's only thanks to the foresight or intuition or good judgment, let's say, of the director of the gallery at the time, Eric Brown, that we have had so many Group of Seven and Tom Thomson works in our collection, that he grasped that this was an important movement in the canon, that these works were interesting and worthy. He started buying Lauren Harris's, very quickly, very soon after they were made or exhibited. Tom Thompson's, I meant to say. And built very early on a collection of Group of Seven works, which we're now so lucky to have, having recognized their importance. Tom Thompson was not officially a member of the Group of Seven, but he's often listed in connection with them because he was very influential to the members of the Group of Seven and very much an inspiration, particularly in his way of working. He was very enthusiastic about going out into nature, observing his subject firsthand, working quickly with paint in front of the scene he was capturing, and capturing it with bold and quick, dynamic brushwork and compositions. And that's a style of working that you may know from the Impressionists, called en plein air, which has not always been used to create landscapes, but was definitely a characteristic of the Group of Seven. Something else that's particularly true of Tom Thompson, but it is also shared by other members, is that many of them were commercial artists and had that background. And in Tom Thompson, you can see that tendency towards really strong dynamic compositions coming from his commercial art background. You can see that in this piece. And as well, a certain stylization of the subject, including the way he puts down the paint on the canvas. So Mylan is showing you kind of one of my favorite elements of this piece, which is the ground and how it's how it's worked with this very thick impasto. We saw this thick layering with barley, but in this case, and if we pan up a little bit to the water and the sky especially, we can see the very geometric, structured way that he's decided to put down the gradation of color in the sky. Almost like bricks or rectangles of color and layered on top of each other. So a slight abstraction, a simplification of the forms of nature, which you will see over and over in Tom Thompson's work, as well as some other artists. Now, I said he was associated with the Group of Seven, but I didn't say why he wasn't a member. Well, many will know that he died in mysterious circumstances when he was not yet 40 on Canoe Lake. And that's part of the reason Tom Thompson is so famous to us today. But he also had a very short and brilliant career, and as I said, had a great influence on the Group of Seven that then formed a few years after his death. Let's move to a woman artist over here next.
Some information for you folks.
So do I. I bring the school kids to this piece a lot when we're looking at bas-relief or low relief. It's a nice modern low relief, right? In this case made out of marble, which is a very traditional material, but this artist actually loved to experiment with materials. She was a sculptor principally, but she worked with modern materials like tin and other materials to sort of push the boundaries and really move sculpture into the modern era. This is Elizabeth Winwood, and there were no women in the original Group of Seven, but we chose to mention them in this tour because it doesn't mean that there were no interesting women artists making very significant contributions to modern landscape art at the beginning of the 20th century. Winwood is one of those women. She was a little younger than some of the Group of Seven, and she ended up being taught by several of them and went on to be very important in certain arts institutions in Canada. She's someone, you can see by the very abstracted and simplified forms of her sculpture that she wasn't going for naturalism, but there are still indications of the kind of very, very Canadian landscape, you know, in this conifer, the way it's been blown by the wind. It's a particular kind of tree on a rocky outcropping. But she was very specific that nature was an inspiration, but that her art wasn't meant to be a copy of nature. There was a relationship between the two, but the art object and the inspiration were two separate things. So she's one woman that has some association with the group of seven and was, you know, like them, important to modern landscape art in the early 20th century. Another whom many will know is Emily Carr, who a little bit later, after the formation of the group, did end up meeting members of the group of seven and formed a friendship with Lord Harris in particular, with whom she carried on a correspondence. And there's evidence of a mutual respect between the two in terms of their artistic practices. She, of course, was also you know, greatly inspired by the natural world and also by modern movements. Particularly, she became interested in the fauves when she studied in France, and that kind of influenced the style of depicting the natural world that she brought to her work. Do we have some questions, Mylan?
No, it was just some good comments. We have a lot of people saying this is breathtaking.
It's really, yeah, I think this is a kind of somewhat hidden work, or somewhat overlooked maybe because it's in this room with all these bright colors, but...
It's true. What I do like about this work though is that you can kind of imagine your own colors. And often when I bring school groups here, particularly this area underneath the clouds, a lot of people think, oh, is that rain? Is that wind?
Yeah.
Is that sun rays? And so it really, you know, no matter the intention that she might have had, I like that it kind of brings out the imagination in the viewer.
Yeah, there's a certain ambiguity, you know, halfway between representation and abstraction that leaves it quite open. And if you do like Elizabeth Winwood's work, please check out the other, when we're finally open again, please check out the other works by her in our Canadian and Indigenous galleries, because there are a few to check out. Let's move to our last stop after you get the label for this.
So here we have Elizabeth Winwood, Passing Rain, 1928, carved 1929. So we will stay online for a couple more minutes just after we talk about this piece. So if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below.
So I was really excited with the Varley landscape in the first room to talk about his kind of slightly messy, very painterly, gestural style of painting. And what's interesting about this artist, Lord Harris, is that though he was part of the group, his style is a little distinct, I would say, from some of the other artists. He has a much more simplified style. He sort of gives a minimalist feel to the landscape that he's depicting by making the natural forms into, you know, geometric, smoothed out forms. And he's one of the artists in this group also that imbued his works and sensed in the landscape a sense of the spiritual and of a greater meaning, which is not necessarily true for all of the artists in the group, but certainly was the case for him, and it was something that developed more and more in his style. And his style becomes more abstract as well. You can see he also is choosing a very limited palette. Several of his works will have, you know, blue, green, white, gray, and it's a very cool palette overall. Light frequently plays a large role, and in this work, you can see that the light seems to be significant, maybe symbolic. Again, coming back to that subtext of, or symbolism of, a spiritual meaning, a transcendental meaning. eventually Lauren Harris abstracts his shape so much that he eventually ends up in a mode of pure abstraction. And we do have a very cool abstract piece by him a little further on in our galleries if you ever want to check that out.
I just want to mention here, some of the colors might not be coming through perfectly just because of the lighting that we have here, and my shadow might be getting caught. My apologies. So I'm hoping that these close-ups are to your liking.
You can see that the brushwork is much more hidden than in the previous works that we've looked at.
Especially in the clouds here, it's just so, blended.
When I bring school groups to a room full of Lauren Harris's, one of the first things they say is that it's very cartoony. So this brings us to the end of our tour together of a handful of choice works by the Group of 7 and associated artists today, again to celebrate the 100th anniversary of their first exhibition in 1920. Please, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comments now. And otherwise, I think we'll probably say goodbye.
If you haven't had any questions, we've got a lot of thank yous and so happy to see these.
Please also stay tuned on Instagram for future tours that will be happening in our spaces. We are working on that now, so there may be more to see in the galleries in the weeks to come.
Thank you, Morel.
Thank you. Bye-bye.